The wisest man who ever lived closed his eyes for the last time, and the moment he did, everything Israel had built began to collapse. We talk about Solomon's glory, his gold, his temple, his legendary wisdom. But what Sunday school never tells you is what happened the instant that man's heart stopped beating. Because the peace of Israel didn't just end, it exploded. And what came pouring out of that explosion would take a nation 500 years to survive. To understand the terror of what came after, you need to understand what Solomon had become. Because the Bible does not spare us, it documents with brutal honesty the slow deterioration of a man who began on the throne of God and ended at the altars of demons. Solomon rose to power as the most promising heir Israel had ever seen. His father David was the man after God's own heart, a warrior, a poet, a repentant. But Solomon was chosen to be the builder. God himself granted him the honor of constructing the sacred temple in Jerusalem, the house where the divine presence would dwell among men. And in his early years, Solomon was everything God hoped for. When God appeared to him at Gibeon and said, "Ask for whatever you want," Solomon did not ask for riches, he did not ask for power, he asked for wisdom. And God, so moved by that answer, gave him wisdom and wealth together. But there is an invisible curse that follows every man who reaches the top of the world: the belief that the rules were not made for him. The Torah had commanded the kings of Israel not to multiply horses, not to accumulate excessive gold, and above all, not to take many wives, so that his heart would not turn away. Solomon violated all three commandments. He accumulated thousands of horses brought from Egypt. He accumulated gold in quantities the human mind could barely comprehend. And he took wives, not 10, not 50, not 100. The Bible tells us, with a coldness that cuts straight through you, 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, 1,000 women in total. They came from Moab, from Ammon, from Edom, from Sidon, from Egypt. They came carrying their gods, their rituals, their altars, their entire religious worlds with them. And Solomon, in his old age, began to follow those gods with them, not out of theological confusion, but for the most ordinary reason imaginable. He wanted to please the women he loved. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 4 says it plainly. When Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of his father David had been. That is not poetry. That is a spiritual death certificate. And these were not philosophical abstractions he was worshipping. These were entities the text identifies with terrifying precision. Ashtoreth, the goddess of war and fertility, worshipped through rituals of sacred prostitution. Molech, the god of the Ammonites, for whom children were thrown alive into fire as a sacrifice. Chemosh, the abomination of Moab. Solomon did not merely tolerate these cults, he built altars for them. On the hills surrounding Jerusalem, the same city where the temple of God stood in all its glory. The Holy Land was being spiritually contaminated. The temple of the living God and the altars of demons shared the same skyline. And the people watched, because the king was setting the example. Because if the wisest man on earth found it acceptable, who was the common person to question it? And then his heart stopped. Before Solomon even died, God had already pronounced judgment. In 1 Kings chapter 11, God appears to the prophet Ahijah and sends him to find Jeroboam, a young official who had distinguished himself as a capable administrator. Away from all eyes, Ahijah takes the new cloak he is wearing, tears it into 12 pieces, and hands 10 of them to Jeroboam. The message is unmistakable. God is going to tear the kingdom from Solomon's hands. 10 tribes will be given to Jeroboam. Only 2 will remain for the house of David, for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem. But here is what most people miss. This prophecy was not for some distant future. The moment Solomon closed his eyes, the clock hit 0. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, traveled to Shechem to be confirmed as king over all of Israel. And this is where everything begins to collapse in real time. The people of Israel, exhausted from decades of forced labor, crushing taxation, and endless conscription for Solomon's pharaonic building projects, came forward with a simple and deeply human demand: lighten the yoke your father placed on us, reduce the burdens, be a different kind of king, and we will serve you faithfully. It was a golden opportunity, a chance to heal the nation with a single act of political mercy. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to consult his advisors. The elders, experienced men who had served his father, told him to be gentle, to respond with compassion, to lower the burden, and Rehoboam dismissed them completely. Instead, he consulted the young men he had grown up with, the sons of the elite, the ones who had never sweated a single drop building his father's palaces. And they told him what he wanted to hear. Show power. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father disciplined you with whips. I will discipline you with scorpions. On the 3rd day, Rehoboam spoke those words to the people, and in an instant everything shattered. 10 tribes ripped their loyalty from their hearts and threw it in the face of the house of David. The battle cry that echoed through Shechem was a cry of permanent separation. What share do we have in David? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. 10 tribes went north, to Jeroboam, to the kingdom that became known as Israel. Only Judah and Benjamin remained with Rehoboam, forming the southern kingdom of Judah. What had been one powerful nation was now split in two. Not cleanly, not surgically, but torn, bloody, ragged, and chaotic. Families divided, loyalties shredded, borders drawn where none had ever existed. Almost immediately, civil war threatened. Rehoboam, furious and humiliated, sent Adoniram, the head of forced labor, to reimpose control. The people stoned him to death, and Rehoboam barely escaped to Jerusalem in his war chariot. The kingdom had not cracked, it had shattered in hours, and the prophecy of Ahijah had been fulfilled to the letter. What God announced through the tearing of a cloak had manifested as the tearing of a nation. But that political rupture was only the visible surface of what was happening, because underneath it, in the spiritual dimension, something far darker was being unleashed. In the biblical worldview, behind every false god stood a real spiritual malevolence, a power that received worship, gained strength from it, and exerted real influence over the physical world. The Apostle Paul would confirm this much later, writing that what the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. But Paul was not inventing new theology. He was articulating what had been embedded since Deuteronomy and the Psalms. The false gods were real demons, and Solomon had invited those demons inside Jerusalem. He built their altars, their sanctuaries, their houses of worship. He legitimized their presence in the Promised Land. While Solomon lived, his prestige functioned as a kind of restraint. With his death and the division of the kingdom, that restraint vanished completely, and what had been tolerated became dominant. The altars were not torn down, the rituals continued, and without a unified king capable of taking a national stand, idolatry did not merely persist, it proliferated. 1 Kings chapter 14 describes Judah under Rehoboam with devastating language: sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. Shrine prostitutes in the land, the nation that should have remained faithful because it still had Jerusalem and the Temple of David, had fallen into abominations comparable to the very nations God had driven out to give Israel that land. And this happened practically immediately after Solomon's death. Meanwhile, enemies who had been sleeping at Israel's borders were now wide awake and hungry. Hadad the Edomite, whose entire family had been massacred by David's general Joab, had spent his entire life as a refugee in Egypt, waiting. When David died, he went straight back to Edom and became a constant military thorn in Israel's side for the rest of Solomon's reign. Rezon of Damascus had seized Syria and harassed Israel from the north for decades. While Solomon lived, his power kept these threats from becoming catastrophic. The moment he died and the kingdom fractured into two smaller, mutually hostile, internally distracted nations, the equation changed completely. The sleeping enemies awoke to a feast. And in the northeast, beginning to sense the weakness of the Levantine corridor that Israel had once dominated, Assyria had started its implacable imperial expansion. Then came the act that sealed the fate of the northern kingdom permanently. Jeroboam was an intelligent man, intelligent enough to understand that his power had a problem. 3 times a year, Mosaic law required every Israelite man to appear before God in Jerusalem for the great festivals. But Jerusalem was in Judah. Jerusalem was his rival Rehoboam's capital. If the people of the north kept going to Jerusalem, their hearts would stay tied to Judah, and eventually they might turn against Jeroboam altogether. So what did he do? He cast 2 golden calves and said to the people the most chilling words any leader could have spoken, words that echoed the single worst moment of Israelite history, the words Aaron himself had used at the foot of Sinai while Moses was still receiving the commandments. "Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." He placed 1 calf at Dan in the north and 1 at Bethel, a city loaded with holy memory, the place where Jacob had dreamed of the ladder to heaven. By placing an idol there, Jeroboam was deliberately contaminating sacred ground. He invented a counterfeit religion with the aesthetic of Yahweh worship and the spiritual content of the paganism Solomon had introduced. He appointed unauthorized priests. He created competing festivals, and the people followed because it was convenient, because it was close, because it demanded nothing real. The text of Kings repeats a phrase like a funeral drumbeat through every chapter that follows. "And he walked in the ways of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin, not 1 king, not 2. Every single king of the northern kingdom is judged against that same measure." The sin of Jeroboam became the founding spiritual DNA of the nation, passed down generation to generation like a cursed inheritance. And in 722 BC, less than 2 centuries after Solomon's death, Sargon II of Assyria took Samaria after a 3-year siege and deported the Israelite population to the depths of his empire. The 10 tribes were absorbed into other peoples, dissolved into the ancient world, erased as a national identity. History calls them the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Judah survived longer, but only longer. The same apostasy was growing in the south, the same pattern, repeated reign after reign. There were exceptions, Hezekiah, Josiah, kings who attempted genuine reform, but those reforms were always partial, always followed by generations who returned to idolatry. And as Judah oscillated between faithfulness and betrayal, Babylon was rising. When Nebuchadnezzar turned his eyes toward that small surviving nation, he did not find a spiritually fortified people. He found a nation carrying 2 centuries of nearly unbroken idolatry, like a sentence already pronounced. In 587 BC, the walls of Jerusalem were breached. The temple Solomon had built was set on fire. The sacred vessels were carried off as trophies, and the people were chained and marched into exile. Jeremiah, weeping at the city gates, pleading with the people to repent before it was too late. He was reaping what Solomon had sown. Every altar Solomon built was a brick in the foundation of that disaster. Every idolatry tolerated was a crack in the wall that should have protected Israel. But behind all of this, behind the split kingdom, the demonic altars, the awakened enemies, the corrupted temple, the seeds of Babylon, there was still a God who had not abandoned his people, a God who had warned, who had promised consequences and delivered them, but who had also promised restoration, who promised that the same throne of David, diminished by Rehoboam's arrogance, would one day produce a king who would never corrupt himself, a king whose wisdom would make Solomon look like a candle next to the sun. The fall of Solomon is not just a history lesson, it is a map that shows exactly where compromise with darkness leads, where the normalization of evil ends, where power used for personal appetite at the expense of the people under you always arrives. What Solomon allowed inside Jerusalem in the name of love, or politics, or prestige did not stay in Jerusalem. It never does. What we invite into our homes, our nations, our cultures never stays contained where we imagine. It always expands. It always costs more than we agreed to pay when we signed the contract. Solomon himself had written in the book of Proverbs that there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. He wrote that and then lived the exact opposite, and Israel paid the price in blood for generations. The question this story leaves behind is not about Solomon, it is about you, because every generation gets its own version of this test, its own golden calves, its own comfortable substitutes for real devotion, its own altars built on convenient hills. The only question is whether you will read the map or repeat the story. Now, before we close, there is something important you need to know about everything you just heard. This account comes entirely from the Bible, specifically from the Book of Kings, and while it is a powerful and deeply detailed narrative, it is not the only account of Solomon that exists in sacred scripture, because in the Quran, Solomon is not a fallen king, he is a prophet, a righteous servant of God, one of the most honored figures in all of Islamic tradition. And the Quran directly addresses the accusations made against him. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 102, God himself says, "It was not Solomon who disbelieved, it was the devils who disbelieved, teaching people magic and falsehood, and then attributing their corruption to Solomon's name." So the story of a king who built altars to demons, who followed 1,000 wives into idolatry, that version of Solomon is explicitly rejected in the Quran. The truth of who Solomon really was, his wisdom, his power over the wind and the jinn, his conversations with birds, his devotion to God until his very last breath, that story is waiting for you. And it reads nothing like what you heard today. If you want the full picture, open the Quran. Start with Surah An-Naml, start with Surah Saba, and then decide for yourself which version of this man honors the truth and which one buries it.